Today is the presentation Northeast States Carbon Policy Update, presented by Michael Trunzo of the firm Schenker, Russo & Clark in Albany. And also Michael is the president of Northeast Public Affairs in Saratoga Springs, New York. Michael's career has spanned government, politics, and trade associations. Michael was also the Chancellor for Government Relations at the State University of New York, CEO of the Empire State Petroleum Association, CEO of the New England Fuel Institute, and held several posts in New York State government, including Chief of Staff to the Lieutenant Governor and Chief of Staff to a State Senator. Michael holds a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's in political science from Long Island University, CW Post Center in Greenvale, New York. Housekeeping matter, while we are having a little bit of technical difficulty with the screen sharing, we are not having difficulty with questions. So if you would just be sure to ask your questions in the question function in GoToWebinar, we will be sure they are asked. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here today with the Eastern Energy Expo On Demand webinar series. Today I'll provide you an update on the carbon policies being considered in the Northeast states. As Eric mentioned, our firm, Schenker, Russo & Clark, is based in Albany. We represent the National Biodiesel Board, which is the biodiesel renewable diesel producers in the United States. We coordinate their policy initiatives throughout the Northeast. I also represent the New York State Energy Coalition, which is the heating oil dealers in the New York City metropolitan area, including Long Island and Westchester. So today I'm going to provide you with general overview of the carbon policies that are being considered regionally as well as state by state, and provide you with some sense of what's happening. So prior to 2009, there were 7 states in the country that had comprehensive carbon policies. By 2019, 18 more states joined that list. So if you were just looking at a map of the United States, you would see that those states cover both coasts and encompasses basically 50% of the US population, 90% of the heating oil consumed, and 40% of the motor fuel consumed. Every state in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic has adopted greenhouse gas emission reduction policies. They range from 30 to 40% carbon reduction by 2030 and to 80 to 85% reduction by 2050. For power generation, many of those same states have set renewable energy goals varying between 30 and 70% by 2030 and 70 to 100% by 2050. Regionally, there's one program in place and another that's under development as a proposal. So 10 states, Delaware through Maine, participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. So RGGI is a cap and trade program for power production, which sets carbon emission limits, and offset credits are bought and sold by those producers. The states reinvest those proceeds in energy efficiency programs, and RGGI has been successful in reducing carbon emissions and power production in the Northeast by 45% since 2005. So it's been, it's been proven that regional solutions, do work. The new proposal is called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, and it's a cap and invest program, a proposal aimed at limiting emissions from transportation fuels. 13 states, Virginia through Maine, are participating in that discussion. Currently, not every state is on board with in the one direction. There are several governors who have shown some pause relative to the program because it is a general increase in consumer gasoline prices, and that is not politically acceptable, and especially in light of COVID-19 and its impact on the economy. It seems like any proposals that could potentially increase costs to consumers are not being viewed in any great light these days. So in light of all these carbon policies that exist in the states, we can see that they're changing our societal standards to a cleaner fuel. And the home heating industry in the Northeast US has positioned itself accordingly. They understand that they need to adapt and transition to a cleaner burning fuel to survive this legislative onslaught. And in September 2019, NEFI held a summit in Providence, Rhode Island, and out of that conference came what's known as the Providence Resolution. And the resolution sets forth a series of initiatives or paths that the industry has set for themselves in order to meet the greenhouse gas goals, of the government, and to have a policy that could survive as we move forward as an industry. So, kudos to NEFI for bringing the industry together in Providence last year, and resulting in this resolution, which has been adopted by all the Northeast states as a way to drive carbon policy. So the resolution itself speaks to having a 15% decrease by 2023, a 40% decrease in carbon by 2030, and net zero by 2050. So it sort of puts the whole industry on the mark to meet where we need to go. So as we...
Michael, let me interrupt you. Next slide. The problem is putting the PowerPoint into the slideshow presentation. Don't ask me why. So, Michael, we're advancing it in a reduced format here. So you can tell, just say advance when you're ready to go to the next slide.
So go back to the New York slide if you can. There we go. So at this point, let's start to take a look at the policy issues happening in each of the states. There is a lot happening state by state, and those policy discussions will impact the future of the home heating industry. And it seems like, interestingly, many of the state policymakers on the staff levels are talking to each other more so than they have previously. So neighboring state issues are starting to meld together a little bit. And part of that could be because of TCI, where they're just trying to collaborate a lot more. So let's start with New York. It's a state that probably has some of the most activity going in it right now. So in 2019, New York enacted what's known as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It set forth the most aggressive carbon reduction policies in the Northeast. It crosses all sectors of the economy, calls for a 40% reduction by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. Specific to the power sector, power production, it calls for 100% renewables by 2040. Right now, the state is probably only at about 28% renewables, but they still have this goal to meet 100% renewables. As we speak with policymakers in New York, they are considering an all renewable fuel strategy. That includes biodiesel and renewable diesel in their plans. They've had very specific discussions how they see both those fuels for transportation and space heating. So we're hoping that as the Climate Action Council, which was a body created by the legislation, starts to fully develop its policies, that those policies will move forward that include biodiesel and renewable diesel into the future. The goal here obviously is to have a liquid deliverable low carbon fuel that retailers can continue to deliver to their customers. So the Climate Council has met a couple of times already. They're going to meet again on this coming Monday. Their initial plan is due by December 2021 and their final plan by December 2024. This next week, we're expecting that they're going to appoint some advisory panels that will be we'll be having a series of public meetings around the state over 6 months or so, and then make recommendations to the Maine Council on how to try to implement and meet the strategies that the state put forth for its climate goals. So a couple other things in New York right now, we have a 5% biodiesel blend requirement in the New York City metropolitan area. That includes Long Island and Westchester counties. That 8-county region is 70% of the heating oil market in the state. So New York uses 1 billion gallons of heating oil a year. So that's 700 million gallons of fuel in that downstate area. New York City also has its own local law to increase the blending levels to 20% by 2034. So we've been working with the retail groups in New York and with the National Biodiesel Board on pending legislation to bring biodiesel blending statewide. And that proposal currently is looking at B5 by 2023, B10 by 2025, and B20 by 2030. Initially, the retailers had put a B50 proposal on the table, but as the legislation started to get discussed with the policymakers, B20 seemed to be the target that they are looking at. So we're hoping that as we go into the 2021 legislative session in New York, that legislation will get consideration. New York is also considering a low carbon fuel standard, similar to California, to reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sector. So there's active policy discussions on an LCFS in New York, and it's one of the only states in the Northeast that is having that discussion. Next slide, Eric. Let's go back one, sorry. So as you can see, we've done a lot of grassroots work in New York, and we have a number of environmental groups that have signed on in support, including the New York League of Conservation Voters, the Concerned Citizens for the Environment, the New York Public Interest Research Group, and the American Lung Association. So we've been, really doing our homework in terms of trying to move forward, with the environmental groups, on our side, and it's been a good coordinated effort across the board. Next slide, Eric. So moving on to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. In New Jersey, the governor filed his energy master plan in December 2019. It's a roadmap for electrifying all sectors of the economy. They are looking to phase out fossil fuels in the building sector by 2025. They have been working on their state building codes and are, using the International Energy Conservation Code, which limits emissions on the fuels that can be used. So, there's a movement on a number of fronts relative to phasing out fossil fuel use in New Jersey. Just moving on to Pennsylvania, if I might, the state does have a biodiesel requirement for the transportation sector, and that's all based on in-state production capacity. Based upon, the level of biodiesel produced in that state, the biodiesel blend requirement for on-road would increase, and currently it's just at 2%. There is pending legislation in the House in Pennsylvania that would bring that same program to the space heating sector. Passage of that is probably a little bit of a long shot, but it is legislation that's being considered, and we're happy to work with Pennsylvania Petroleum Association, on that and other pieces of legislation that potentially could be considered. Next slide, Eric. So Rhode Island. Rhode Island is the only other state other than New York to have a biodiesel blending requirement for space heating. It is a 5% requirement statewide. Currently, they have legislation pending that would increase that blend to 10% by 2023, 20% by 2025, and 50% by 2030. Those bills have been introduced in both the House and the Senate. There was a hearing in the House, which the National Biodiesel Board participated in. We're working closely with Roberta Fagan of the Energy Marketers Association of Rhode Island, and that hearing was in February pre-COVID, and since the pandemic has hit, legislative activity has pretty much stopped in many states, but it has stopped in Rhode Island. So we're hoping that next year that legislation will continue to get legs. There was good conversation at that hearing relative to the legislation. There's two regulatory efforts also underway in Rhode Island. There's the Heating Sector Transformation Program, excuse me. That's looking at how to transition the space heating sector away from fossil fuels and to a clean energy alternative. There have been comments filed on that relative to how biodiesel blending can help the state achieve its goals. We'll continue to monitor and work on those issues as that moves forward. There's also a carbon pricing study underway to look at the impacts of carbon tax on fuel use and industries and consumers. So it'll be interesting to see where the state moves on potential carbon pricing. In Connecticut, there are several items in Connecticut that are very active. There's a thermal renewable energy credit program rulemaking underway. They have been looking at establishing a TREC program to incentivize the use of biodiesel. So we've been working closely with the Connecticut Energy Marketers Association on that rulemaking. We're hoping that will move forward, and that will be a program that could be all inclusive of advanced feedstock definitions and provide a robust incentive program for biodiesel blending and for marketer participation in the state. The governor also appointed a council on climate change that is looking at numerous ways to achieve climate reduction goals, and some of the things they've looked at have been on the building side, in their building subcommittee, a thermal renewable energy credit program. So obviously they're supporting and asking the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to move forward on that as soon as possible. The other part that they came up with was using biodiesel blends of B20 up to B50 as a transition fuel to get consumers off of fossil fuels, distillates, natural gas, and propane. So it's a very exciting development in terms of the use of biodiesel blends for residents in that state. While it does seem like the governor's council is looking at it as a transition, we truly feel, and working with SEMA and their executive director Chris Herb, that once the state, if they moved in this direction, were to have homes using biodiesel blended fuel, they would find that there really is no need to transition them out of a liquid heating fuel and to electrification. So we're hoping that will be part of the movement that we see in Connecticut. Connecticut does actually have a biodiesel blending law on the books. Its implementation actually relies on contiguous states adopting a similar law. So in this case, it would be New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Until all those states had a law, this one would not trigger. But it is something that possibly could be addressed as biodiesel requirements may move in different states. Next slide, please. In Massachusetts, they have a blending incentive program for biodiesel in place. It's called the Alternative Portfolio Standard, and it is currently an incentive program that pays retailers a credit for every gallon of biodiesel they sell. That's blended into their heating oil. It's a very robust program. It actually has been very successful. It's probably moved biodiesel blending in the state to about 4 or 5%, I believe. The program is currently under a statutory administrative review scheduled for this year. COVID had put that on hold, so we're hoping that will maybe come back on and be active, before the end of the year. The current program in Massachusetts limits the feedstocks to use cooking oils, basically. And there's been a a movement to try to expand that definition to an advanced feedstock definition for biodiesel production. That would, just allow a lot more biodiesel to be used in the state. The Commonwealth is also taking aim at fossil fuels through its building codes, similar to what's happening in Connecticut. They're relying on, in New Jersey, they're relying on the International Energy Conservation Code to, limit fossil fuel use in the states. They also have some interesting local laws being considered in Massachusetts. So the town of Brookline recently banned fossil fuel appliances in new residential commercial construction, and several other states in several other cities in the state have been looking to do the same. But a couple of weeks ago, the Massachusetts Energy Marketers Association received a favorable legal decision from the state's attorney general that the local law was unconstitutional and cannot be enforced. So that was a big win for MEMA and Michael Ferrante, their executive director. And we're hoping that will ward off some other local discussions on the local level on the same type of initiatives. The next slide. In Maine, Maine has several different climate initiatives happening all at once. The Maine government, similar to New York, established climate change adaptation strategy, which was quite aggressive. They have a climate council in place that has met several times now, and they've released their work group recommendations. They are looking at relying on a lot of homegrown renewables, if you would. They have obviously a big forest industry in the state, and they're looking at the potential of renewable fuels from waste as well. So we've been working with the folks in Maine, the Maine Energy Marketers Association and the governor's office, and looking at how we can try to advance biodiesel and biofuels in that state. The Maine Energy Marketers are also looking at ethyl levuminate as a renewable fuel that is under development now, and how that might help move homegrown biodiesel in that state, if you will. So we're looking at a number of different fronts to see how that might move along. The state also has a thermal renewable energy credit rulemaking underway. So to incentivize biodiesel use, they have a new law that put in place a renewable chemical blending tax credit, and biofuels, including biodiesel, are eligible for that tax credit. It's 0.05 cents a gallon. So that's another program that the state's put in place. And they also have a very aggressive heat pump installation program to move as many homes to electrification as they possibly can. The law requires 100,000 heat pumps be installed in the next 5 years, and I believe they're already at about 50,000 in the past 5 years. In Vermont, like Connecticut, Vermont has a biodiesel blending law in place that relies on contiguous state adoption to trigger its implementation. Obviously, with New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire not having statewide laws, that has not been triggered. There is in Vermont pending legislation called the Global Warming Solution Act. It's basically a proposal on accountability to keep the state's policymakers' feet to the fire on hitting their greenhouse gas reduction goals. It allows for a private right of action that citizens could bring against the state if they feel that they're disenfranchised by the lack of progress. It's a very interesting proposal, and I know that the Vermont fuel dealers and Matt Cota, their president, has been, they've been fighting on that proposal, and they've had a number of carbon tax bills over the years that they've been able to, ward off, and they've been doing a very good job protecting industry in that state. Lastly, in New Hampshire, there aren't really any pending fossil fuel use pieces of legislation or carbon policies being discussed in that state. As I've said in other settings, their license plate slogan says it all: they're free or die. So we don't really see much happening in terms of policies on mandates and such in that state. So in conclusion, I know this is a lot to absorb in a short period. The region is very, very active. I think this gives you a flavor of how serious government agencies are in cleaning the environment, and the potential legislation that's pending throughout the region really is geared to, move the industry to another place. I think as, a consultant to the industry, as we look at, trying to move forward and keeping a liquid, deliverable liquid low carbon fuel as a product that can keep this industry in business, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and biofuel blends is really kind of where we need to be headed in the future. So Eric, that is a summary of what's going on across the region. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or at least try to answer questions that your attendees might have.
Thank you. Okay, so the first is a global question. Will the slides be available? They certainly will. Anyone who is registered for this session, which you have to do to be participating, we will send this presentation to you. If for whatever reason you don't get it by, tomorrow, I have up in the answer section my email, which is edegero@fmanj.org. Again, everyone who is registered will receive a copy of the presentation. Okay, next question, or that's an answer to a general question. Michael, New Hampshire has, quote, no policies pending relative to fossil fuel use, end quote. But I'm curious if any legislative discussions have taken place relative to biodiesel implementation in either transportation or home heating space.
So the New Hampshire has participated in the Transportation Climate Initiative discussions, but I believe their governor, Mr. Sununu, has sort of backed off that policy, noting that the cost to consumers is a concern of his. On the biodiesel front, there is no pending legislation that I'm aware of right now, and on there's been a number of questions relative to the fuel and its use in cold climates, and even the cost potentially. So, there have been more discussions on that front than anything pending that I've seen.
I am going to give a quick little preamble before I ask this next question, which is rather short, and that is, this is a question relative to the TCI, which you mentioned. For those of you that are interested, on Friday morning, we will have a more in-depth discussion of TCI. We broke this as the committee, we broke this down into two sections because there is a lot happening in the Northeast region. So we're looking at the carbon policy, carbon inventory, carbon tax, carbon, all sorts of carbon reduction, electrification. In Michael's presentation this morning, where we had a flavor of what's happening in the states, Friday specifically, we'll be focusing on TCI, with maybe a mention a little bit about what's happening in the other states. So today is primarily focused on the bigger picture issue of looking at carbon policy overall as it straddles both the transportation and the building sectors, with a little bit of TCI. Friday will be primarily TCI with maybe a little bit on carbon policy. With that as a preamble, Michael, any thoughts on TCI?
Well, I think the discussions, the potential of TCI to increase the cost to consumers has become an issue in states that have sort of backed off a little bit. So, in a policy like that has a cap and invest program, there is a cost to consumers, and it potentially, based upon, the proposals that have been out there, starts at about 17, 18 cents a gallon, and can escalate, beyond that, depending upon, how they price the, how they price carbon. So, overall, I don't know if the whole region will ever be able to get behind this one program as they have RGGI. It's very different, and this is a direct cost onto consumers. So it'll be interesting to watch. I know that as we talk to policymakers in different states, they are excited about it. They like to try to head down that road, but I think as you go up the chain in government and get to the higher levels, that the political impact, if you will, of policies becomes more of a concern.
And I will just take the moderator's prerogative and from echo what Michael said, that as you look at a increase in tax in a tax on consumers at 17, 18, 25, put whatever the baseline is, because keep in mind many of these proposals in TCI are to establish a baseline on a metric ton basis and increase by $5 per metric ton through there. The political reality from elected officials, as well as from some trade unions. When you tax fuel and the revenue goes to something other than the building of roads and bridges, it brings other people to the table. So just my 2 cents on that from this perspective. Michael, what's your opinion on the likelihood that Connecticut will continue to defeat the carbon policy?
Connecticut?
Yes, on the likelihood Connecticut will continue to defeat the carbon policy. That is the question. And if I'm sorry, the carbon tax. There was a clarification that the author made to it.
So the Connecticut Energy Marketers Association, has had several carbon taxes proposed before them, and they have been able to battle them back. I think as governments, and maybe not specifically to Connecticut, but as any government continues to look at these policies, depending upon how aggressive their policymakers want to be in terms of a cost to consumers, this is something that's going to be weighed. I think COVID has given pause to a lot of policies that could potentially increase a cost to a consumer, given what's happened to the economy. So, the hope would be that in Connecticut and in other states like Vermont and Massachusetts, where there's carbon policies, carbon tax policies, pending, that those will all get beaten back based upon the cost factor.
The next question, I'm actually going to take 2 questions because they're sort of 2 sides of the same question. So part A of the question is, do you know what the Biden-Harris policy is on energy and the environment? That's A of the question. Then part B of the question would be, does the White House even control relevant? Is White House control even relevant in the carbon tax policies regionally in the Northeast? So first part is, what is the Biden-Harris policy on energy and the environment? And then the next one is, how relevant is the White House control to these carbon policies in the Northeast?
So you'll forgive me, but I am not an expert on following all the federal policies relative to relative to climate change. So I have to apologize for not being able to answer that. I think in terms of White House control, yes, there is a general impact that can be affected depending upon how the federal government deals with the renewable fuel standard, the discussions of a low carbon an LCFS nationally, how fuel is treated in that regard. So yes, while federal policy will deal in some degree with it, the policies on the state level are probably much more realistic in terms of dealing, state by state.
If New York adopts a low carbon fuel standard as California has done, will that drive production of biodiesel in this region, or will we be relying on the central United States to increase production and move it to the Northeast?
So one would think that if the low carbon fuel standard or or any biodiesel blending requirement policies are adopted in the region, that will drive regional biodiesel production up. Depending upon the states that move the policies and how much volume it would create in terms of demand, that's it's sort of a market signal to biodiesel producers as to whether they can, transport fuel into the region, or whether it's more advantageous to build, a site regionally. The hope would be that, as if New York and other states move forward, those are pretty large volumes of fuel that would be needed, that would trigger, some local development for biodiesel and renewable diesel.
Okay, next question. Oops, sorry about that. The New York State CLCPA, I believe that's their clean energy law. The New York State CLCPA announced a limit for 2030 that is equal to 60% of 1990 greenhouse gas emission levels. The proposed New York State bioheat mandate calls for a B20, which is about a 15% greenhouse gas reduction. How will a 15% greenhouse gas reduction be received in Albany for bioheat when New York State has stated this 40% reduction target?
That's a good question. So the marketer member associations in New York actually proposed a legislation that would move to B50 by 2030. So that would be about a 37% reduction. So the limits are not specific to any particular industry. It's a statewide goal that the state has set. When we've had discussions with the policymakers in New York, the legislative sponsors, as well as the policy teams and the governor's office and the agencies, that discussion began at B50, and they were the ones that scaled it back to B20. So it actually is being received in a good way, because they look at it as an initial step in the right direction to help moving the homes that are 1.5 million homes in New York that use oil heat, moving them to a cleaner blended fuel. So while it doesn't necessarily meet the the greenhouse gas reduction target of the 40% reduction, it is moving in the right direction. And I think when you speak with folks on about policy, they look at heading in the right direction as a good signal. So the thought with the policymakers is that if we can get to a B20, as industries mature and technology advances, we'll be able to go further.
That is the last question that I have in the queue. If anyone else has a question, I'm going to make a little announcement about tomorrow's program because it's directly relevant to this. So if you have a last-minute question, feel free to type it. I'll come back in a second. So tomorrow, as we've been doing every day this month at 10 a.m., a live program. Tomorrow is the first of 4 Wednesdays that we will be running the NORA and Eurofuel joint presentation, The Future of Liquid Heating Fuels, a European and North American conference. Tomorrow, Wednesday, August 19th at 9 a.m. So we have a different start time tomorrow. Tomorrow's start time is 9 a.m. That's primarily because our friends in Europe are going to be with us as well. And as you know, it's a couple hours ahead. So they'll be having cocktails, I guess, while we're having coffee. Tomorrow, we'll review the policy actions being taken in the United States and the European Union. How will the goals of decarbonization affect the liquid fuels industry? How will the producers and users of the fuels respond? Additionally, industry visions for both the U.S. and Europe will be reviewed and discussed. We have a who's who, if you will, from our side of the pond and the European side of the pond, leadership of the liquid fuel industry from the heating perspective in the U.S., as well as our counterparts, including the John Huber of Europe will be participating, and there will be a mix of presentations from 9 a.m. until noon Eastern tomorrow. So today was an overview of carbon policy in the northeastern states. Tomorrow is a policy review in the U.S. and in Europe. And then Friday is the Transportation Climate Initiative. Specifically, we will have the commentary from refiners, from distributors, as well as from businesses more broadly. So we will have AFPM, the Maryland Distributors Association, Fuel Distributors Association, our colleague Ellen Valentino, and the National Federation of Independent Business. So that's Friday. So again, the schedule is tomorrow, 9 a.m. U.S., Europe, first of 4 Wednesdays on what's happening on both continents. Is 9 a.m. tomorrow, and then Friday is 10 a.m. In between on Thursday, we will have Gray and Gray talking about the power of joint ventures. So that is the rest of this week's lineup. 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's been 10 a.m. so far. 9 a.m. tomorrow, 9 to noon, with a pretty packed agenda, a number of speakers, each speaking for 10, 15 minutes each. So a lot of rapid fire information from a global perspective tomorrow, 9 a.m. You can register for that. It's a separate registration, but you can register through the Eastern Energy Expo website. Will take you to the NORA portal that has the registration that you need to be able to participate tomorrow. I am going to go. Please remember to check out all of our, not check out, but to visit all of our exhibitors that are part of our virtual trade show. We have 125 that are participating with us. Schedule your time to visit with them. And I will now look to see if we have any final questions that came in, and there have not been any. So I thank you all for your indulgence this morning with us. I think that once we got up and running, you saw a program of enormous value that speaks to the enormous challenge that we have. And I am very thankful that a friend that's as knowledgeable and connected within the industry as well as within government is helping us in that fight with Michael Trunzo. So with that, thank you, Michael. Thank you for everyone participating. We will see you 9 a.m. tomorrow for the NORA Eurofuel conference on the future of liquid heating fuels, and then back at 10 a.m. Thursday and 10 a.m. Friday. And again, Friday will be the TPI focus. So thank you all, and have a good day until we see you all tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Thank you.